Please stand for the reading of the Bible. This is Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 through 10. Genesis 12, 1 through 10. Okay. Now the Lord said to Abram, Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And Abram took Sarai his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. When they had came to the land of Canaan, and the Lord appeared to Abram and said, To your seed I will give this land. And there he builded an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. And Abram journeyed, going on still towards the south. And there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down into Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was grievous in the land. Amen. You may be seated. Okay, so we've been talking about the history of Abraham for the past several weeks. So now that we know that Abraham's history was recorded to teach God's people about God's righteousness. That's the point of having Abraham included in the Bible, is to teach God's people about God's righteousness, what it consists of, and then how are we imputed God's righteousness, which is the persevering faith by which God imputes his righteousness to the sinner. Now that we know that's the point about Abraham, what's all this about in Genesis 12? What's going on? So what seems to have happened is God appeared to Terah and to his sons, namely Haran, Nahor, and Abraham, to move to Canaan. So not only Abraham, but to all, starting with Terah. However, the call was toward all, but only Terah and Abram responded to God's call. So there was a general call, and only Terah and Abram responded. Then Terah fell away in Haran, and Abram stayed with his father in Haran in order to encourage him to continue. In other words, Terah saw all the greenery, and he's like, I don't want to go to that desert. I feel safer here, where all the green stuff is, next to the rivers. And Abram tried to encourage Terah, we need to continue, Dad. We need to continue. But Terah fell away. This is a similar situation to a later call of Israel out of Egypt, where the first generation all died in the wilderness except Caleb and Joshua. And rather than God making his covenant with the first generation, God actually says he made the covenant with all those that are alive after 40 years. That's what we looked at last week. So there's two views here, two simultaneous points of view. On the one hand, those who persevered in faith, those who were not staggered in the promise of God, but were fully persuaded that God would accomplish that which he promised. They were the ones that God made his covenant with. That's the point about Abraham. There's a persevering faith that's necessary to be imputed God's righteousness. So on the one hand, the people that God calls, they're responsible for that persevering faith. But on the other hand, it was God who chose to give such a faith. And it's God who chose who should receive his covenant. So on the one hand, they're responsible, but on the other hand, it was God who chose to give them these faith. And it's God who chose who should receive his covenant by God's infinite wisdom, and not by any works or special merit of the person themselves. It's God who just chose out of his infinite wisdom, saying, I decided from my infinite wisdom to give this guy a persevering faith. So this is the hidden grammar of the imputation of God's righteousness. It's God who decides to give the sinner a persevering faith, to persevere in his promise. And yet the sinner is still responsible for that faith which God has given to persevere. So in our limited reasoning, these seems like a contradiction. How can we be responsible for something that it's up to God to give. How are we responsible for that? And actually, God's going to use Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob to develop this hidden grammar here. So in our minds, we see these as contradictions, but that's because we're limited in our reasoning capacity. Why? Because ours is a created reasoning. In other words, it's a derived form of reasoning from the infinite God who has infinite reasoning. In the mind of God, these things make sense. And he's portraying it, so it's not explicit here, but he's portraying it in a way where we can see there's both sides of this. So these two things are not in contradiction in God's mind, whereas they seem contradictory to us only because of our limited understanding or our limited reasoning capacity. Limited created capacity. So as sinners, we have a choice here. That it is God who gives the persevering faith. So in other words, as a sinner, and even when these things don't make sense to us, especially like where they seem apparently contradictory, we have a choice to make. Do we still hold both as true? God is responsible, and we're responsible. God is the sole source of giving this persevering faith, but at the same time, are we responsible? Now, as sinners, we have a choice. Do we hold both of these as true because God said these both are true? Which is that it is God who gives the persevering faith based on his infinite wisdom alone and not by any merit or work or favor of the sinner. And yet, the sinner is responsible for this persevering faith that God gives. The sinner can say both is true. Or the sinner can say, wave his hands, hey, it doesn't make sense to me. That's contradictory. In fact, I can't believe this because God's being contradictory here. It's either God is responsible because he's the one that's causing us to have this faith, or we're responsible. So one or the other. So sinners have a choice here. We can say both are true because God said both are true. Or we can, and remember, this is according to our limited capacity of understanding. Or we can say in our limited reasoning, it doesn't make sense, so I can't believe that. So when Terah dies, Abraham realizes that the promises made to Terah and his sons was only actualized by God to Abraham alone, because he's the one that responded to the call, but at the same time, he's the only one that ended up persevering. So there's a general call to the whole family, but God only particularly brought Abram to Canaan. That's the point. There was a general call to everybody, but only brought one person. And therefore, Abraham left Haran and entered into Canaan with Lot and Sarah and all the slaves and stuff that he acquired in Haran. So this is Genesis chapter 12, verse 6 now. And Abram passed through the land. And Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, to the plain of Moreh. And the Canaanite was then in the land. Question. Why does God mention that the Canaanites were in the land? What's the point of that? Well, from a historical point of view, it means that this passage, from a historical point of view, it means that this passage, well, Abram was the original author in a kind of written or oral document of what's going on in his life. So Abram's the original author, but historically speaking, it means that there was a later editor who referenced back to this and then made that note. The Canaanites were not in the land. Or at that time, the Canaanites were in the land, but not right now. That's the note that's being made here. So most likely it was either during Joshua's conquest, which is later, or a priest scribe like Ezra, or a priest prophet like Jeremiah, who was told by God to make these edits here, to make explicit God's point in these narrations, which is about the imputation of God's righteousness. So the fact that the Bible mentions that the Canaanites were in the land, that becomes significant when we're talking about God's righteousness here, and the persevering faith necessary for the imputation of that righteousness, for the accounting of that righteousness. So the fact that Canaanites were at Shechem, and specifically at Moreh at this time, is significant because it lets the reader know this particular promise of God, right, which is the giving of the land, this particular promise of God to give Abram and his seed the land will require a long time. That's the point. You guys understand? Because if the people who own the land are still there, how are you supposed to get it? Well, they have to, eventually move out. But people don't just, like, a nation doesn't just move out of their country. So you see what's going on here? It's going to take a long time. So when we're talking about persevering faith, we're not talking about like a few years. We're talking about a long time. And that's why that particular point is being made there. It brings into view perseverance of faith that God will fulfill his promise even after the death of Abraham. That's what's getting at. That's what it's getting at. Even after the death of Abraham. So in other words, Abraham wasn't thinking like, oh, within my lifetime, God will definitely move all these people out. That's not what Abraham was thinking. Abraham was thinking, even if I die, right? Even if I die, I might not receive the promise, but my children will receive the promise. That's the kind of faith that Abraham had. Does that make sense? So maybe I can put some wheels to this thing so that the car meets the ground. Oftentimes when we pray, we sort of expect God to immediately answer us, but that's not persevering faith. That's not persevering faith. Because when God answers is up to God. When God fulfills his promise, that's up to God. So the when is up to God. And the how is up to God. But the fact of the matter is God said he will do it. And then our faith in that promise is what constitutes persevering faith. That's the point. In other words, for this particular promise of God, perseverance in God's promise means to hold to God's promise and to be fully persuaded that God will accomplish his promise, even as Abraham was breathing his last breath. Even as he's breathing his last breath, he's saying, God will fulfill his promise to give this land to my seed. That's persevering faith. Why? Because Abraham would not see the fulfillment of this promise, that God would give him the land of Canaan, as long as the Canaanites were in the land. He wouldn't be able to see the fulfillment of that promise. So the parallel for us Christians then, right, just to, again, make it more concrete, bring this down to earth, a parallel for us Christians is our resurrection is tied to the return of Jesus Christ as judge. You guys know that, right? So it's not like we just resurrect. We're actually waiting for the coming back of Jesus Christ because our resurrection is tied to his return. We might live to see Jesus return. We might. Or we might not. We might not live to see Jesus return. And might not get to see our resurrected bodies, even long after we die. But the hope to see Jesus return, to take us, and to resurrect us, that should be our daily persevering faith. That's the point for Christians. So daily, we should actually be waiting for the return of Jesus Christ. And if you understand that, and if you read the New Testament with that understanding of persevering faith, then you can see every single chapter of every book of the New Testament is focused on that, the return of Jesus Christ, and how they were all waiting for that, because the resurrection is tied to that. And for them, it was a daily persevering faith. And this faith is the faith that our fathers in the faith had passed down to us. This hope to be alive, to see the return of Jesus, to see his return in our lifetime. That was the hope. But if we don't, to continue to persevere in hope of his return even after we die, if we don't get to see it in our lifetime. That was their persevering faith. So this was the faith of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, the Apostle Paul, right? Philip, Stephen, all these guys. But if you ask the average Christian, what is their hope? Would they have the return of Jesus and our resurrection as their persevering faith? If you just ask an everyday Christian, would they have that faith? Here's Luke 18, and this isn't, I'm not bringing these questions out of nowhere. These questions have already been asked in the Bible. Luke chapter 18, verse 8. This is Jesus talking after he talks about to constantly pray, to continually pray. He made a parable about an unjust judge and a woman asking an unjust judge to decide rightly for her, and then this is the conclusion of the matter. I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, when he comes back, shall he find faith on earth? Right, so even Jesus is asking this question. And then 1 Peter 3:15, but sanctify the Lord in your hearts and be ready always to give an answer to every man that asks you a reason of the hope that is in you with meekness and fear. So we should always have this answer when somebody goes, hey, why are you a Christian? What are you hoping for? What are you trying to get out of it? We should always, daily, we should always have an answer for them, which is we're waiting for the return of Jesus Christ, because our resurrection is tied to that. Our justification, the imputation of God's righteousness is tied to his coming back. So, Abraham then is our forerunner in this faith, understanding that he might not get to see the fulfillment of God's promise in his lifetime, but being fully persuaded that God will accomplish that which he promised to do. So even, we're going to see later, even as he dies, he's holding on to that faith. So here's Hebrews chapter 11, verse 13 and 14. These all died in faith, not having received the promises, but having seen them, the promises, afar off, and were persuaded of them and embraced them and confessed that they were strangers and pilgrims of the earth. For they that say such things declare plainly that they seek a country. So they were like, yeah, we're strangers here. We're strangers here because there's a greater thing that we're waiting for. This is not, what we're waiting for down here. It's up there in heaven. And to start here just means to have faith means to be fully persuaded and to embrace or receive the promise of God. So God says, I will definitely perform this. And then to be fully persuaded of that is what constitutes persevering faith. And the reference for this is, moreover, brethren, this is from 1 Corinthians 15:1. I declare to you the gospel which I preached to you, which also you have received, and wherein or in which you stand, being fully persuaded, by which you are also saved, if you keep in memory what I preached to you, unless you have believed in vain. So the point here is our faith doesn't just come out of nowhere. There's actually a genealogy, and it goes all the way back to Abraham. Any questions or comments so far? Okay. And I hope this is making sense, because the thing that I really want to emphasize here is, like, we don't want to just throw out these words like righteousness of God and holiness of God and faith. These are all, like, these words have meaning. But unfortunately, the current, in the current world that we live in, a lot of Christians use these words without knowing what these mean. And therefore, when asked about our faith, we have no genuine answer. It's just like a repeated phrase that we've heard from, like, TVs or read magazines or, like, another sermon. So I'm trying to tether these things into reality so we understand what our faith is about, what constitutes this persevering faith. So the fact that Abraham is saying, we're strangers here with you, right? We live among you, but we're strangers here. That already points us and lets us know Abraham already had a heavenly vision in mind. So when God says, I promise to give you and your children or your seed this land, Abraham's not only thinking, this is the land that I have to stake my life in. That's not what he's thinking. He's saying this is a temporary placeholder for the actual land, the heavenly land. And of course we're talking about the temple presence of God called heaven when we're talking about that greater country, or the great country, or the actual country. And a persevering faith is the means of inheriting that actual country land. So that's why it's significant that the Bible mentions that the Canaanites were in the land at that time, because it sets up this persevering faith of Abraham, from which we derive ours, we derive our faith as well. So he's the forerunner, and then it was passed down to that persevering faith was passed down to us. That's the point. So this is Genesis chapter 12, verse 7. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your seed I will give this land. And there he built an altar to the Lord who appeared to him. So after Abraham leaves Ur, God appears to Abraham again and reaffirms. So once he comes into the land of Canaan, God reaffirms or confirms God's earlier promise to Abraham, which is from verses 2 and 3. So this is from 2 and 3. So this is when he was in Ur, so before he left for Canaan. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name. So this is the one that Terah fell away from. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, and you shall be a blessing. And a note here, in the Tower of Babel incident, the people themselves were trying to make themselves a great name. But here it's God who's doing the great naming. Right? So there's a bifurcation of like wills here. That was the people's will, and then here's God's will. And I will bless them that bless you, and curse them that curses you, and in you all the families of the earth, or all nations of the earth, shall be blessed. Okay. So we're just thinking through this, because God is reaffirming, in verse 7, he's reaffirming this covenant. But the covenant seems, it doesn't, in other words, it doesn't look anything like the first calling, because when God reaffirms the covenant, he says, to your seed I will give you this land. Where is that in the first two verses? That God's going to give his, children the land. Where is that? But it's actually there. How is God going to make Abraham's name great? How is God going to do that? By making him a blessing to all the families, or all the nations of the earth. So God is going to make Abraham's name great by making him a blessing to the families and nations of the earth. So I will bless you and make your name great, right? How is he doing that? By making him a blessing. How is he going to make him a blessing? By blessing them that bless you and cursing them that curse you, and by blessing all the families of the earth in Abraham. Right? There's a sequence here. How is God going to make Abraham a blessing to all the nations? Is the question then. Right? Because I'm hoping this is not too technical, but we're trying to follow along with how is that a reaffirmation of this promise of God? God says, I'm going to make you a great nation, and I'm going to make you a great name. How am I going to do that? By making you a great blessing. How am I going to do that? By making you by blessing all the nations in you, I'm going to bless you. And then by blessing you, I'm going to make you a great name. So we're going, right? So the question we ask is, well, how is God going to bless all the nations in Abraham? That's the question then. How is God going to do that? And that's the answer to verse 7, which is, I will give this land to your seed. To your seed I will give this land. That's God's answer, saying, by giving this land to your seed, all the nations will be blessed in you, and then by being blessed in you, you'll be a blessing, and then by being a blessing, your name is going to be made great. So, so then we go, wait, hold on. How is giving the land of the Canaanites to Abraham's seed, right? How is that going to be a blessing for all the nations of the earth? And just to bring in current events here, isn't that the platform that the current state of Israel is running on? Aren't they saying, yeah, we're going to become a blessing to all nations by taking that land? Isn't that the platform they're running on? So is that what God is saying here then? I'm going to bless the nations by making sure the Israelites take this land? Is that what God is saying? And without pulling any punches, I hope you know, Israel has been involved in creation of a lot of wars around the world. So no, God is not talking about the Jews here. He's not talking about the platform that Israel is running on. But God is talking about his Messiah, as Paul later points out. This is Galatians 3:16 now. Now to Abraham and his seed were the promises made. God says, not and to seeds, plural, as of many, but as of one, and to your seed, singular, which is Christ. So God's promise to give that land to Christ is the promise, and that's what's going to bless all the nations. How is that possible? How is given that land? And remember, that land is a placeholder for heaven. It's a placeholder. So how is giving that land, all the land of the earth, not only that land, but even the heavenly land, how is giving that land to Christ a benefit for all nations? Well, as much as I love our constitutional republic, the greatest form of government is to be ruled under a God-fearing, perfectly righteous king. That's the greatest form of government ever to exist. Unfortunately, there has been no person, with the exception of Jesus Christ, of being perfectly righteous. Everybody has their own will that they want to accomplish. In other words, that kingdom cannot exist, that perfectly righteous kingdom cannot exist as long as sinners are kings. As long as sinners are kings, that perfectly righteous kingdom cannot exist. So here's some Bible references for further reading on this subject. What's the greatest form of government? This is 1 Kings chapter 10, verse 8. Happy are your men. This is, Queen of anyway, so there's a woman named Queen of Sheba. And the Solomon's wisdom has been such the rumors about Solomon has been spreading across all the earth. So people are coming to ask him like very difficult questions to see how he would answer. And Queen of Sheba is one of them. And she's like one of the most powerful queens at that time. So she comes to Solomon, and then she asks all these difficult questions. And then Solomon wisely answers all her questions. And then she's so surprised. She's like, I can't believe a nation like this exists. And this is her conclusion. Happy are your men. Happy are these your servants, which stand continually before you, and that hear your wisdom. She's talking about Solomon's wisdom, which God gave. Blessed be the Lord your God, which delighted in you, to set you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord loved Israel forever. Therefore made he you king, to do judgment and justice. In other words, Solomon's wisdom was put to use through for the specific purpose of ruling God's people of judgment and justice. Righteousness, in other words. It's a righteous king. So Queen of Sheba realizes the depth of the wisdom of God that he gave to Solomon. Wisdom to know and understand God's righteousness according to God's word in order to rule God's people with, it's not perfect righteousness here, but it's pretty close. So here's Ecclesiastes chapter 10, 16 and 17. Just to, reiterate what the Bible's talking about here. Woe to you, O land, when your king is a child and your princes eat in the morning. Blessed are you, O land. So now we're foiling a contrast here. Blessed are you, O land, when instead your king is the son of nobles and your princes eat in due season. They eat for strength and not for drunkenness. They're not eating for pleasure here. They're eating for strength in order to do, make proper use of all the stuff, etc., etc. In other words, they're ruling righteously. And for further reference, please read the entire Psalm 72, which is about Jesus, which is about the Messiah, who you know is Jesus King, who we know as Jesus Christ. It's his rule in his kingdom in perfect righteousness. This is Psalm 72. And I know there are people that think certain kinds of socialism work, but actually, Psalm 72 is a proof text for why Christianity is absolutely incompatible with any form of socialism without remainder. And this is because all things belong to that king, the righteous king. And in his absolute and perfect righteousness, he distributes his resources in perfect judgment. Anyways, that's not important to our topic here. It needs to be said because we have to sort of understand this idea of a righteous government. Because then we understand why God is saying to give the seed the land is a blessing to all the nations. So we have to have this background understanding of what kind of government is good. And then the second question is it compatible with our current situation? And the answer is no. Because as long as sinners have power, you can't have a righteous government. You can't. Because we tend to corrupt. There's a saying that goes, power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. So anyway, that's not important. So that's not important to our topic, except to say that the seed of Abraham inheriting the land of Canaan is a temporary placeholder for the actual land of heaven, which Abraham's seed will inherit and rule with perfect righteousness. That's the point. His ruling of perfect righteousness is what makes it a blessing for all the nations, because there will be no oppression, no unjust laws, no unjust use of resources, no unjust violation of rights, but it'll be a perfect justice system, a perfect righteousness system. So by being the inheritor of the land, actually the seed of Abraham becomes the inheritor of the people of the land. So when God says, I'm going to give you this land, right, he's not only talking about the land, he's talking about the people of the land as well, because they live there. In other words, when God made that promise to Abraham, God could have just as well have said, his seed, Abraham's seed, will inherit the nations of the land, and not just the land. Because he's talking about the whole thing as if it was a kingdom. And he's saying this seed of Abraham, by having him inherit all these people to rule with perfect righteousness, that's a blessing for all nations. Any questions or comments? Okay. So, I'm not trying to lose you guys here. But on a side note, here's Isaiah chapter 19, verse 25. And to me, this is surprising. Isaiah chapter 19, 25, Psalm 33, 12, and then Psalm 82, 8. Whom the Lord of hosts, so we know about inheritance, right? It's Abraham's seed that's supposed to receive the inheritance of the land and the people of the land. We understand that, right? We have to have that understanding to understand this side note here. It's a side note now, but after the king's period, it's going to become a huge focus. But right now, it's just a side note. Whom the Lord of hosts shall bless, saying, Blessed be Egypt, my people, and Assyria, the work of my hands, and Israel, mine inheritance. Okay, so the Lord has an inheritance. Blessed is a nation, and this is not just once, blessed is a nation whose God is the Lord, and the people whom he has chosen for his own inheritance. Arise, O God, judge the earth, for you, Lord, shall inherit all nations. Aren't you supposed to receive inheritance from your father? Then how is God able to inherit anything? Does God have a father?
No.
Actually, nice try, Stephen, but actually, that's why it's a side note here. It's not explicit, but it's God who's supposed to inherit all nations here. And God's promise to Abraham was his seed will inherit the land and all the people. So there's already a hint of like, the Messiah is not a normal person. He's not just this regular guy. There's a hint here that he's divine. That's the point. But it's a side note here. It's like so, it's not even like considered. It just passes by. But the later Old Testament writers will pick this up. And they'll say, they're going to say, oh, our kings have failed us. Our kings have failed us, but there's a righteous king that's coming, the Messiah. Anyway, just a side note. Any questions or comments? Okay, if there's no questions or comments, I just want to give you time to sort of like process all like what's going on here. But yeah, this is why Abraham's story, his history is important, because it's a sort of like a map of what it means to persevere in the faith and to hold on to the promise of God. It teaches like what that's about. And then that becomes important for us, because if there are people like Tara that fell away, that means even within, and we're not teaching you can lose your salvation. Again, God's going to he's going to expand on this through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. But Tara fell away from this promise. And the Hebrew author is going to pick up on that as well. But what I want you guys to understand is there is such a thing as persevering faith, and it's that persevering faith that constitutes saving faith, because that faith is what's necessary for the imputation of righteousness. Yeah, so if there's no questions, we'll take offering and then praise and then benediction.